And there's been a lot of talk today about some things that Ann Shushat had said on an interview, a podcast interview with JAMA yesterday. It was the Heart of an Axios article this morning where she is quoted as saying this is really the beginning of this pandemic, and that's the quotation that they pull out. But actually, she said quite a few other things in there, which I think show you the level of...
Jack.
Yes, sir.
Jack, hang on for a second. Why is she important? Give her title. This is important because she's a senior member of the Trump government. This is why it's so important. It's why Axios highlights it. And what she said, I thought was pretty explosive, if that's the only thing you saw.
Right, and she's the principal deputy director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She's had well over a 30-year career in the organization. She should be an absolute pandemic expert. Now, when she said this is really the beginning, and that's what's been pulled out by everybody, and they had a long conversation, and I'll post this podcast on my Twitter feed and on our Twitter feed. It's about 35 minutes long. I watched it early this morning to try and get more background. It's actually kind of a fascinating study, and she's talking about how do we get control of this, and she says a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. He said, well, we get so much different information from you guys, and she said, listen, because we are learning so much every day, the data can be very confusing, and much of it, she said, let's be real, has been contradictory over time. So one thing that we've tried to always say on this show, and it's something that I think that we still have to remember, this is the end of June right now. The very first case we had here was only 4 months ago. So the learning curve on this has been dramatic in terms of modern science. She also says some things that I thought were quite interesting. He asks her questions about the face shields and maybe why shouldn't people wear a plastic mask over top of their masks. And she said, well, we really don't have any good data to prove that will help. And then he says, well, why would you use that in a hospital setting? She says, well, because in a hospital setting, we're just doing as much as we possibly can. But for normal people, that's probably not that important. Now, the thing that I thought was very, very important in this, and it comes down to whether or not we need to open up, and she echoes something that Fauci had said the other day, which I think is quite surprising for most people, which is this notion that they really do not have any understanding as to how long these antibodies will last, how long they will be effective. She said at one point that there's some evidence that people with mild infections may not even create adequate antibodies. So, she said we're looking around the world, and even in countries where they've had massive infection rates, like Sweden, where they kind of let it run and theoretically should have one of the highest levels of infection in Europe, she said we're nowhere near the level necessary for herd immunity. And then she said, with this disease, unlike with an influenza, we may have to start recalibrating what we think of as herd immunity.
What does that mean?
I.e., if you don't necessarily retain the antibodies for great lengths of time, or if you don't necessarily...
So this could just potentially be a comeback thing every year.
Right, and there's some indication about the idea of...
Raheem, to be brutally frank, is what they're saying is that this virus, you may not even... The concept of herd immunity, which Sweden and others in England went after, may not actually be relevant here. You may not even be able to have herd immunity. That's how complicated this thing is, right, Jack? Is that not the point?
This is true, and there's some evidence that sort of supports her, querying about this idea. In that, last week in the Oxford vaccine study, they found that people who got double dosages of the vaccine had much greater amount of antibodies. So it may just be that the vaccine needs to be at a higher level to create the antibodies. But it's very, very confusing. Now, what she also said, which I thought was interesting, Steve, you remember about 6 weeks ago we brought up the study in Arizona that was looking at the genetic decay of the SARS-2 virus, the CCP virus, and comparing it to the genetic decay of the original SARS virus from 2003. And they noticed that some segments that were similar to the ones that were dropping out of the original SARS were dropping out of this one. So there was speculation as to whether or not this virus was decaying in a way that would mean that it was less lethal, which is what actually they believe happened to SARS-1. Now, what she said, which I thought was really interesting, she said there is a definite genetic difference between the West Coast version of the virus that's hitting, say, Southern California and the Southwest, and the virus that hit New York City. And we see this little difference perhaps in the lethality of it in a broad subject matter. So, as always, this is an absolutely moving target, and if we want to go into the testing versus the number of cases, that's an extraordinary topic that we can run through here pretty quickly,
I'd like
too.
to, I'd like